The shadow of a vulture circled overhead as Lucinda Blackwood stepped off the stagecoach onto the dusty main street of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1883. The blazing July sun beat down on her black morning dress, making her feel as though she was being slowly cooked alive, but the heat couldn't compete with the cold emptiness that had settled in her chest 3 months prior. "Madam, your bags," the driver called, holding out her worn leather valise and hatbox. Lucinda took them without meeting his eyes, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground as she had since the day they'd lowered her baby boy into the earth. At 24, she'd already lived a lifetime of sorrow. First her husband Thomas, dead from influenza last winter, then little William, just 4 months old, taken by the same fever that had spared her. The doctor back in St. Louis had recommended the dry desert air might help her melancholia. Her sister had arranged everything: a teaching position at the town's small schoolhouse and a room at the local boarding house. Lucinda hadn't protested. Nothing mattered anymore. "You must be Miss Blackwood." A plump woman with kind eyes approached. "I'm Mrs. Holloway from the boarding house. Let me help you get settled." Lucinda nodded mutely and followed. She'd perfected the art of existing without participating in life. She responded when necessary, ate when food was placed before her, and slept when exhaustion overcame her. But she hadn't smiled since that terrible day, and laughter seemed a foreign concept from another lifetime. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure, faded by the relentless sun but meticulously maintained. Inside, the parlor offered blessed relief from the heat, and Mrs. Holloway showed her to a modest but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Holloway informed her. "The washroom's at the end of the hall. School term doesn't start for another month, so you've got time to get acquainted with our little town." Lucinda nodded, waiting for the woman to leave before sinking onto the narrow bed. She unpacked mechanically, arranging her few possessions with precise care, everything in its place, just as she tried to keep the fragments of her broken heart contained. Later that evening, she forced herself to go downstairs for the promised meal. The dining room held 3 other boarders: an elderly man who introduced himself as the town's barber, a middle-aged woman who worked at the general store, and a young man who stammered something about the telegraph office. Lucinda answered their polite questions with as few words as possible, her eyes never rising above their collarbones. Days passed in this manner. She walked the streets of Copper Creek, familiarizing herself with its layout: the general store, the sheriff's office, the saloon where piano music spilled into the street each evening, the church where she couldn't bring herself to enter. She visited the schoolhouse and prepared lessons, finding some small comfort in the routine of it. 2 weeks into her stay, Lucinda was returning from the general store with supplies for her classroom when she heard the commotion. A herd of cattle was being driven through the main street, cowboys shouting and waving their hats as they guided the bellowing beasts toward the stockyards at the edge of town. She stepped back against the boardwalk railing, clutching her packages to her chest. The dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves filled the air, making her cough. She lowered her head, waiting for the procession to pass, when something slammed into her. Her packages went flying as she stumbled backward. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, and she found herself looking up into the suntanned face of a man with eyes the color of a summer sky. "My apologies, madam," he said, steadying her before bending to gather her scattered purchases. "That yearling broke from the herd. Didn't mean to frighten you." Lucinda stood frozen, taking in his appearance: tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dust-covered clothes and a worn leather vest. His dark blonde hair curled from beneath a battered hat, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jawline. "No harm done," she murmured, accepting her packages from his outstretched hands. "Haven't seen you in town before," he remarked, studying her with interest. "I'm Preston Wells." "Lucinda Blackwood," she replied automatically. "I'm the new schoolteacher." "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Blackwood," he said, tipping his hat. "Hope that rowdy calf didn't give you too much of a fright." "I'm fine, Mr. Wells." He looked as if he might say more, but a shout from down the street drew his attention. "Preston! We need you!" "Duty calls," he said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Hope to see you around town, Miss Blackwood. She watched him jog back to the herd, efficiently mounting a copper-colored horse and guiding it into the thick of the cattle. Something stirred within her, not emotion exactly, but awareness. It had been so long since she truly noticed anyone. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Holloway was full of news about the cattle drive. Preston Wells brings his herd through twice a year, she explained, passing a bowl of potatoes. Owns the Diamondback Ranch about 20 miles north. Good man lost his father 2 years back and took over the whole operation at just 27. Lucinda nodded, not encouraging further conversation, but Mrs. Holloway continued undeterred. He'll be in town a few days. Always stays at the hotel rather than riding back each night. Says it gives his men a chance to blow off steam, and him a chance to conduct business. She gave Lucinda a meaningful look. Handsome fellow, isn't he? And unmarried, too. Lucinda stared at her plate. I'm a widow, Mrs. Holloway. The older woman's face softened. Yes, dear, I know. Your sister wrote me everything when she arranged your position. Such terrible losses, one after another. But you're young yet, with many years ahead. Lucinda excused herself early that night, unable to bear the well-meaning platitudes. In her room, she removed the locket she always wore, opening it to reveal 2 tiny portraits, Thomas on one side, William on the other. Her baby's face, captured when he was just 2 months old, healthy and smiling, brought the familiar ache to her chest. I miss you, she whispered, tracing the image with her fingertip. I miss you both so much. The next morning, Lucinda decided to visit the small library housed in the back of the church. She would need books for her students, and focusing on work was the only thing that brought her any relief from her grief. As she crossed the street, she heard her name called. Preston Wells was stepping out of the general store, looking considerably cleaner than the day before. Good morning, Miss Blackwood, he said, falling into step beside her. Where are you headed this fine day? The library, she answered, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. Mind if I walk with you? I've got business with the pastor anyway. Before she could refuse, he was beside her, shortening his long strides to match her pace. He carried a package under one arm and tipped his hat to everyone they passed. How are you finding Copper Creek? He asked. It's adequate for my needs. High praise indeed. He chuckled. Most newcomers complain about the heat and the dust. I'm not most newcomers. His expression sobered as he studied her profile. No, I don't imagine you are. They walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you're from St. Louis. That's quite a change. Yes. Any particular reason you chose our little town? My sister arranged it. Ah. Another silence. And your husband? Died last winter. Preston nodded slowly. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Blackwood. The sincere sympathy in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, she managed. They reached the church, a modest white building with a small steeple. Lucinda headed for the side entrance that led to the library while Preston continued to the main doors. Perhaps I'll see you again before I leave town, he said. She nodded noncommittally and slipped inside, grateful for the dim coolness of the small library. The church secretary, Mrs. Peterson, helped her select appropriate books for different age groups, and Lucinda lost herself in the task of examining texts and making lists. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice how much time had passed until Mrs. Peterson apologetically mentioned she needed to lock up for lunch. Gathering her notes, Lucinda stepped outside and nearly collided with Preston again. We have to stop meeting like this, he said, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. I was just heading to the hotel for lunch. Would you care to join me? Lucinda's instinct was to refuse, but her stomach chose that moment to rumble audibly. She hadn't eaten breakfast, and the boarding house was at the other end of town. The hotel dining room is quite respectable, Preston added. No impropriety in dining there. Very well. She relented, too hungry to argue. The hotel restaurant was surprisingly elegant for such a small town, with white tablecloths and real silverware. Preston pulled out her chair and ordered for both of them after a brief consultation roast beef sandwiches and iced tea. "So you'll be teaching our local youngsters," he remarked when the waiter had gone. "Brave woman. I've taught before," she said. "In St. Louis. Any particular age you prefer?" "The younger children," she answered automatically, then felt the familiar stab of pain. William would have been a schoolboy someday. She would never see him learn to read, never help him with his numbers. Preston seemed to sense her distress and changed the subject. "I understand from Mrs. Holloway that you arrived about 2 weeks ago. Have you had a chance to see much beyond the town?" Lucinda shook her head. "The territory has some beautiful places. Just north of my ranch, there's a hidden valley with a waterfall and natural pool. In this heat, it's like finding paradise." Their food arrived, and Lucinda was grateful for the interruption. The sandwich was surprisingly good, the bread fresh and the beef tender. She ate slowly, listening as Preston described his ranch and the challenges of the cattle business. "My father built it from nothing," he explained. "Started with just 20 head after the war. By the time he passed, we had over 2,000. This year we're driving nearly 3,000 to the railhead in Tucson." "That's impressive," Lucinda said, meaning it. "It's a good life, but a demanding one." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "What about your family, Miss Blackwood? You mentioned a sister." "Yes, Margaret. She's 5 years older, married with 3 children. They live in Philadelphia now." Lucinda hesitated, then added, "My parents are gone. Father died in the war, and mother passed 5 years ago." "So it's just you and your sister?" "Yes." She didn't mention William. She never did if she could avoid it. After lunch, Preston insisted on paying and walked her back toward the boarding house. As they neared the building, he paused. "I'll be in town 3 more days," he said. "Perhaps you'd consider having dinner with me tomorrow evening? The hotel's chef makes an excellent steak on Wednesdays." Lucinda's first instinct was to refuse. She'd had no interest in male company since Thomas died, and the idea of anything resembling courtship seemed impossible with her grief still so raw. Yet something about Preston's straightforward manner made it difficult to simply dismiss him. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said finally. "I've been widowed less than a year." Preston nodded, accepting her decision without argument. "I understand. But should you change your mind, the invitation stands." The next day, Lucinda found herself watching the clock as evening approached. She told herself it was merely hunger making her restless, not thoughts of Preston Wells and his dinner invitation. When Mrs. Holloway announced supper, she went downstairs determined to focus on her meal and ignore the nagging sensation that she'd made a mistake. Halfway through the bland stew, a knock came at the front door. Mrs. Holloway returned to the dining room moments later with a bouquet of wildflowers and a note. "For you, Miss Blackwood," she said, unable to hide her delight. Lucinda accepted them with surprise. The flowers were desert blooms in vibrant yellows and purples, clearly freshly picked. The note was simple. "These reminded me of your spirit surviving and beautiful despite harsh conditions. The invitation remains open. Respectfully, P.W." The other boarders exchanged knowing glances. Lucinda folded the note carefully and excused herself, taking the flowers to her room where she arranged them in the water pitcher. His gesture touched something long dormant within her. No one had given her flowers since Thomas's courtship days. The comparison brought a pang not just of grief for her husband, but awareness of how different the two men were. Thomas had been scholarly and reserved, with a cautious approach to life. Preston seemed to embody the rugged landscape he called home: direct, resilient, unpolished but genuine. Before she could reconsider, Lucinda changed into her second-best dress, navy blue with white piping, the least funereal outfit she owned. She pinned her hair more carefully than usual and added a touch of rose water to her wrists. The hotel dining room was busier than the previous day. Preston stood when he saw her enter, and the smile that lit his face made her suddenly conscious of her racing heartbeat. "You came," he said simply as he held her chair. "The flowers were lovely," she replied. "Thank you." "They paled beside you," he said, then immediately looked chagrined. "I apologize. That sounded like a line from a dime novel. I'm not usually so flowery in my speech." Despite herself, Lucinda's lips twitched slightly at his inadvertent pun. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest she'd come in months. Dinner was surprisingly comfortable. Preston told stories of ranch life that required little response from her, yet he had a way of drawing her out gradually. By dessert, a delicious apple pie, she found herself sharing anecdotes about her teaching experiences in St. Louis. "My most challenging student was a boy named Frederick," she recalled. "He put a frog in my desk drawer on my third day." "What did you do?" Preston asked, leaning forward with interest. "I picked it up, thanked him for the excellent specimen, and proceeded to give an impromptu lesson on amphibian anatomy. Then I assigned him to care for our new class pet." Preston laughed, a rich sound that drew glances from nearby tables. "Clever. Did it work?" "Frederick became my most dedicated student. He's studying medicine now." The memory brought a bittersweet feeling. That had been nearly 5 years ago, when she was newly married and full of confidence. As they finished their coffee, Preston hesitated before speaking again. "Miss Blackwood, Lucinda, if I may, I've enjoyed your company tremendously these past 2 days. I'd like to see you again before I leave town." Lucinda stirred her coffee slowly. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Mr. Wells." "Preston, please." He leaned forward, his blue eyes earnest. "I understand you're in mourning." "I'm not asking for anything improper. Just the pleasure of your company for a ride tomorrow. The countryside is beautiful this time of year, despite the heat." She should refuse. She knew she should. But the thought of another day confined to town, with nothing but her grief for company, suddenly seemed unbearable. "A short ride," she conceded. "In the morning, before it gets too hot." His smile was worth the risk. "I'll have horses ready at 8. We'll be back well before noon." That night, Lucinda slept better than she had in months, without the usual nightmares of William's fever-racked body or Thomas's rasping final breaths. She woke feeling almost refreshed and dressed in her riding habit, another concession to practicality rather than mourning. Preston was waiting outside the livery stable with 2 horses, his own copper-colored gelding and a gentle-looking mare for her. "Good morning," he called. "Ready for an adventure?" "A short ride," she reminded him, but allowed him to help her mount. They rode north out of town, following a well-worn trail that wound through mesquite and sagebrush. The morning air was still cool, carrying the scent of dust and desert plants. Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. "The Apache used to camp by that stand of cottonwoods during their seasonal migrations," he explained. "The old chief and my father had a respectful relationship. When the army tried to force them onto reservations, my father helped several families stay on their traditional lands." "That was brave of him," Lucinda remarked. "Not everyone was so understanding." Preston nodded. "Pa always said a man should be judged by his actions, not his ancestry. The land taught him that it doesn't care what color your skin is when a flash flood comes or a rattlesnake strikes." They rode for about an hour before reaching a small canyon. Preston dismounted and helped Lucinda down, then led her to a narrow path between rock walls. "Watch your step," he warned. "But I promise it's worth it." The path opened suddenly into a hidden valley, just as he described, a spring-fed pool surrounded by cottonwoods and flowering cacti, with a small waterfall trickling down the far rock face. The contrast to the arid landscape they'd ridden through was startling. "It's beautiful," Lucinda breathed, genuinely awed. "My favorite place," Preston said, spreading a blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag. "Few people know about it. The local tribes consider it sacred ground." They sat in the dappled shade, sharing the canteen of water and dried fruit Preston had packed. The peaceful setting and his undemanding company gradually loosened something in Lucinda's chest. She found herself speaking more freely than she had in months. "I never expected to end up in Arizona territory," she admitted. "I had my life planned so differently." Preston nodded. "Life has a way of appending our careful plans. When my father died, I thought I'd lose the ranch. I wasn't ready to take over too young, too inexperienced. But somehow I managed. You've done more than manage, from what I hear. Mrs. Holloway says you've expanded the operation considerably." He looked pleased at her observation. "I've tried. Made my share of mistakes along the way." They fell silent, listening to the gentle splash of the waterfall. After a while, Preston spoke again, his voice softer. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you faced some difficult losses recently." Lucinda tensed, her momentary ease evaporating. "Yes. I know something about that," he said carefully. "Lost my mother when I was 12, then Pa 2 years ago. Grief's a hard trail to ride." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Sometimes talking helps," he continued. "Other times, it's just having someone who understands the silence." Tears pricked at Lucinda's eyes. She blinked them back, fixing her gaze on the rippling pool. "I should like to start back soon." Preston didn't press. He packed up their small picnic and helped her back onto her horse without further mention of loss or grief. On the ride back, he pointed out a family of quail scurrying through the brush and a distant mountain peak where snow could sometimes be seen even in summer. By the time they reached town, Lucinda's initial discomfort had faded. At the livery stable, Preston helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I hope you enjoyed it, at least a little." "I did," she admitted. "It was peaceful. I'll be leaving tomorrow," he said. "Heading to Tucson with the herd. But I'll be back through in about 3 weeks on my return." He hesitated. "Would it be presumptuous to call on you then?" Lucinda considered his request. The rational part of her knew she should refuse. She wasn't ready for any kind of attachment, might never be. Yet the thought of never seeing Preston again left her feeling oddly bereft. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said finally. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. "I'll look forward to it. And in the meantime, should you need anything at all, you can send word to the ranch. My foreman stays behind, and he can get messages to me." That night, Lucinda took out her journal for the first time since William's death. She'd kept diaries since childhood, filling them with thoughts and observations, but the words had dried up along with her tears after burying her son. Now she wrote simply, "Rode to a hidden spring today with P.W. It was beautiful. I felt almost at peace for a brief moment." The next morning, she watched from her window as Preston and his men drove their cattle south through town. He looked up as they passed the boarding house, tipping his hat when he spotted her at the window. She raised her hand in a small gesture of farewell. The days that followed settled into a routine. Lucinda prepared for the school term, organizing her classroom and reviewing the materials available. She took her meals at the boarding house, walked through town for exercise, and wrote letters to her sister. But thoughts of Preston intruded with increasing frequency: his easy smile, the respectful way he'd accepted her boundaries, the quiet strength he projected. 2 weeks after his departure, Lucinda was arranging books on the schoolroom shelves when Sheriff Miller appeared at the door. "Miss Blackwood," he said, hat in hand. "Sorry to disturb you, but there's a situation that requires your attention." "A situation?" she echoed, puzzled. "Yes, madam. There's a child, a little girl, over at Doc Harrison's office. She was found wandering outside town this morning. Apache, we think, though she hasn't spoken. Appears to be about 4 or 5 years old." "What does this have to do with me?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well, madam, you being the schoolteacher and all, Doc thought maybe you could help figure out what to do with her. She seems frightened of men, but might take to a woman." Lucinda's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of being near a child, especially one so close to the age William would have reached, was almost unbearable. But the sheriff's worried expression and her own sense of duty wouldn't allow her to turn away. "Very well," she said, setting aside the books. "I'll come at once." The doctor's office was a small building near the center of town. Inside, she found Doc Harrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, and a tiny figure huddled in a chair in the corner. The child was indeed young, perhaps 4, with large dark eyes and tangled black hair. Her dress was torn and dirty, and she clutched a small leather pouch to her chest. When Lucinda entered, those eyes darted to her face, wary and frightened. "Miss Blackwood, thank you for coming," Doc Harrison said quietly. "This little one was found by the Miller boys while they were checking their rabbit traps. No sign of anyone else nearby, though they did find what might have been a campsite about a half-mile away abandoned, with signs of a struggle." Lucinda approached the child slowly and knelt a few feet away. "Hello," she said gently. "My name is Lucinda. Are you hungry?" The girl stared at her silently, but her eyes flickered with interest at the mention of food. "She hasn't eaten since they brought her in," the doctor explained. "Wouldn't take anything from me or the sheriff." Lucinda reached into her pocket and withdrew a piece of hard candy she sometimes carried for her students. She held it out on her palm, not moving closer. After a long moment, the child reached out and took it, popping it into her mouth immediately. Her eyes widened slightly at the sweetness. "What's your name?" Lucinda asked, but received only silent staring in response. Over the next hour, Lucinda gradually coaxed the child to accept a glass of milk and some bread. She still wouldn't speak, but allowed Lucinda to clean the dirt from her face and hands with a damp cloth. "What will happen to her?" Lucinda asked the doctor as the girl dozed in the chair, finally relaxed enough to surrender to exhaustion. Doc Harrison sighed. "Normally she'd be sent to the reservation or an orphanage. But with the tensions between the army and the tribes right now, I'm hesitant to involve officials. And the nearest orphanage is in Tucson." Lucinda looked at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable. Something stirred within her, not the overwhelming love she'd felt for William, but a protective instinct she thought had died with him. "I'll take her," she heard herself say. "Just until we can find her family or make proper arrangements." The doctor looked relieved. "That's mighty generous of you, Miss Blackwood. Are you certain?" No, she wasn't certain at all. But she couldn't bear the thought of this child being shipped off to strangers or a reservation where she might not be wanted. "Yes," she said firmly. "I have room at the boarding house, and school doesn't start for another week. Perhaps by then we'll have located her people." Mrs. Holloway was surprisingly accommodating when Lucinda arrived with the sleeping child in her arms. She helped arrange a small pallet in Lucinda's room and found a nightgown that might serve as a dress once shortened. "Poor mite," she clucked, brushing the girl's hair gently. "Wonder what happened to her family. The sheriff is sending men to investigate the campsite more thoroughly tomorrow," Lucinda explained. "For now, she needs rest and care." That night, Lucinda lay awake watching the child sleep. The steady rise and fall of the small chest brought back memories of watching William in his cradle, the perfect tiny fingers, the soft breath against her cheek when she held him. Tears slipped silently down her face. "I miss you so much," she whispered to the darkness. "Both of you." The next days established a new routine. The girl whom Lucinda called Little Dove, after the design on her leather pouch, gradually became more comfortable. She still wouldn't speak, but would respond to simple instructions and occasionally smiled when Lucinda read stories aloud. Sheriff Miller reported that the abandoned campsite showed signs of an attack: blood on the ground, personal items scattered. There were no bodies, but tracks suggested several people had been taken away on horseback. "Raiders, most likely," he said grimly. "There's a band that's been kidnapping Apache to sell in Mexico. Army's been after them for months." "So her family might still be alive?" Lucinda asked. "Possible, but finding them would be nearly impossible. They could be anywhere across the border by now." The news left Lucinda with mixed feelings. She'd grown fond of Little Dove, whose sweet nature and resilience reminded her daily that life continued even after terrible loss. Yet she couldn't help hoping the child's family would somehow be found. One morning, nearly 3 weeks after Preston's departure, Lucinda was hanging laundry in the boarding house yard with Little Dove, helping by handing her clothespins, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw a familiar copper-colored horse and its rider coming down the street. Preston dismounted in front of the boarding house, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. He looked trail-worn and tired, but his eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. "Miss Blackwood," he called, then stopped short when he noticed the child half hidden behind Lucinda's skirts. "I see you've acquired a companion since I've been gone." Lucinda explained the situation as Little Dove regarded Preston with solemn curiosity. To her surprise, he crouched down to the child's level and spoke a few words in what sounded like Apache. Little Dove's eyes widened, and she responded with a rapid sentence, the first words Lucinda had heard her speak. "You speak her language?" Lucinda asked, astonished. Preston nodded. "Some. My father insisted I learn from our Apache neighbors. Said it was only respectful." He turned back to Little Dove and spoke again, more slowly. The girl answered, then pointed to her leather pouch and said something else. "She says her name is Nahimana. It means mystic in their language. Her family was traveling to visit relatives when bad men came. Her mother hid her in the bushes and told her to be silent and still." Preston's expression grew grave. She heard fighting, then her family was taken away on horses. She waited until morning, then started walking, but got lost. Tears welled in Lucinda's eyes at the child's story. "Ask her if she knows where her family's home is." After another exchange, Preston shook his head. "She knows it's near mountains and a river with big rocks, but that could be dozens of places in the territory." He gently touched the pouch at Little Dove's Nahimana's waist. "That's a medicine bag. The design indicates her clan. I might be able to find someone who recognizes it." "You would do that?" Lucinda asked. "Of course," Preston said, as if helping an orphaned Apache child was the most natural thing in the world. "Every child deserves to be with their family if possible." He hesitated, then added, "But it might take time. Would you be willing to keep caring for her meanwhile?" Lucinda looked down at Nahimana, who had relaxed considerably since Preston had spoken to her in her own language. "Yes," she said. "For as long as needed." Preston stayed in town that day, joining Lucinda and Nahimana for lunch at the hotel and then walking with them to the schoolhouse where Lucinda needed to complete some preparations. He spoke to the child occasionally in her language, though mostly they communicated through gestures and expressions. Watching him with Nahimana, Lucinda saw a different side of Preston, gentle, patient, and perceptive. He seemed to understand the girl's fears without her having to express them, and his quiet confidence clearly reassured her. By evening, Nahimana was following him like a shadow, asking questions that he translated for Lucinda. "She wants to know if you're my wife," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I told her no, that we're friends." "What did she say to that?" Lucinda asked. "She said that's silly, because you look at me the way her mother looked at her father." His cheeks reddened slightly. "Children have active imaginations." Lucinda felt her own face grow warm. "Indeed they do." That night, after Nahimana was asleep, Lucinda sat on the boarding house porch enjoying the cooler evening air. Preston joined her, bringing 2 glasses of lemonade from Mrs. Holloway. "I'll leave for the ranch tomorrow," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I need to check on things there, but then I plan to start asking around about Nahimana's clan. There's an old Apache who lives near my property. He might recognize the design on her medicine bag." "That's very kind of you," Lucinda said. "She's fortunate you came back when you did. I had no way to communicate with her properly. You were caring for her, though. That speaks volumes." He sipped his lemonade. "May I ask you something personal, Lucinda?" She tensed slightly but nodded. "When Mrs. Holloway first told me about you, She mentioned you'd lost your husband. But there was something more, something that had left you deeply wounded. He set his glass down carefully. I see it in your eyes when you watch Nahimana, especially when she sleeps. It's a look I recognize from my own mirror after my father died. Grief, yes, but also guilt. As if you believe you should have done something differently. Lucinda's throat tightened. No one had spoken so directly about her loss since she'd left St. Louis. Everyone in Copper Creek tiptoed around her grief, never mentioning what they surely knew from her sister's letters. You don't have to tell me, Preston added quickly. I just wanted you to know that whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to bear it alone. The kindness in his voice broke something loose inside her. My son, she whispered, the words feeling strange after months of silence. I lost my son. Preston's expression softened with understanding. I'm so sorry. William, she continued, her voice strengthening slightly. He was 4 months old. The fever took him 3 months ago, the same illness that took my husband just weeks earlier. Her hands twisted in her lap. I should have seen the signs sooner. Should have called the doctor immediately when he first felt warm. But I thought it was just the weather, and by the time I realized. It wasn't your fault, Preston said gently. Everyone says that. But I was his mother. I should have protected him. Some things can't be prevented, no matter how much we love someone. He hesitated, then covered her clasped hands with one of his own. My mother died giving birth to what would have been my sister. For years, I blamed my father for not getting the doctor sooner, the doctor for not saving them, myself for not being enough to keep my mother alive. It took a long time to understand that sometimes, despite our best efforts, tragedy happens. Lucinda looked at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. How did you bear it? 1 day at a time, he replied. Some days were harder than others. But eventually I found reasons to keep going. The ranch. The people who depended on me. Small moments of beauty in the world. They sat in silence for a while, his hands still covering hers, until Mrs. Holloway called from inside that it was getting late. Preston stood reluctantly. I should go. The hotel. Wait, Lucinda said impulsively. Before you leave tomorrow. Would you teach me some words in Apache? Just simple things, so I can communicate with Nahimana? His smile returned. I'd be happy to. I'll come by after breakfast. True to his word, Preston arrived the next morning with a small notebook in which he'd written common Apache phrases phonetically. They spent an hour practicing while Nahimana watched with growing delight, giggling when Lucinda mispronounced words. The sound of the child's laughter loosened something in Lucinda's chest. It had been so long since she'd heard such innocent joy. When it was time for Preston to leave, Nahimana clung to his leg, chattering rapidly. He knelt and spoke to her solemnly, then untied a braided leather bracelet from his wrist and fastened it around hers. I promised I'd look for her family, he explained to Lucinda. And I gave her my bracelet as a token of that promise. I told her you would keep her safe until I return. How long will you be gone? Lucinda asked, surprised by how much the question mattered to her. A week, perhaps 2. It depends on what I find. He hesitated, then added, I'll miss you, both of you. After he rode away, Lucinda found herself counting the days, anticipating his return with an eagerness that both surprised and alarmed her. It was too soon, she told herself. Too soon after Thomas, too soon after William. Her heart wasn't ready. Yet when she looked at Nahimana, now chattering happily in a mixture of Apache and the English words she was rapidly learning, Lucinda had to acknowledge that something was changing within her. The crushing weight of grief hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, making room for new feelings. The school term began, and Lucinda found herself busier than ever, teaching during the day and caring for Nahimana in the evenings. The girl accompanied her to school, sitting quietly in the back of the classroom, and gradually interacting with the other children during recess. 10 days after Preston's departure, Lucinda was reading to Nahimana before bed when they heard horses outside. The girl jumped up, running to the window with an excited cry. "Preston!" She called one of the few English words she used consistently. Lucinda's heart leapt as she joined Nahimana at the window. But it wasn't Preston below, it was Sheriff Miller and two other men she didn't recognize. "Stay here," she told Nahimana, tucking the blanket around her before heading downstairs. The sheriff was waiting in the parlor with Mrs. Holloway. The two strangers stood slightly apart, an older man in an army uniform and a younger Apache man in a mixture of traditional and Western clothing. "Miss Blackwood," Sheriff Miller began, "this is Lieutenant Brooks from Fort Bowie and Flying Eagle, who serves as their scout and interpreter. They've come about the child." Lucinda's stomach clenched. "What about her?" Lieutenant Brooks stepped forward. "Madam, we've received reports of an Apache girl being sheltered here in town. Given the current tensions with the tribes, any displaced natives should be properly registered and relocated to the reservation. She has a name," Lucinda said coldly. "Nahimana. And she's a child who lost her family, not a piece of property to be relocated." The lieutenant's expression hardened. "Regulations are clear, Miss Blackwood. The child must come with us." "No." The word came out more forcefully than she intended. "She stays with me until her family is found." "That's unlikely to happen," Brooks said dismissively. "Most of her tribe are already on the reservation. That's where she belongs." The Apache man Flying Eagle spoke for the first time. "The design on her medicine pouch identifies her as Chiricahua, from Red Cloud's band. They've resisted reservation life, but we have relatives there who could take her. Mr. Wells is actively searching for her family," Lucinda insisted. "He speaks some Apache and has connections with the local tribes." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Wells is a respected rancher, Lieutenant. If he's looking into the matter, this isn't a negotiation." Brooks interrupted. "I have orders to gather all unregistered Apache and escort them to the reservation. We leave at first light." He turned back to Lucinda. "Have the girl ready, or I'll be forced to take more direct action." After they left, Lucinda sank onto the parlor sofa, trembling with anger and fear. Mrs. Holloway patted her shoulder sympathetically. "That poor child," she murmured. "After everything she's been through." "I won't let them take her," Lucinda said fiercely. "Not until we know for certain her family can't be found." "But my dear, what can you do?" "The army, Preston will know what to do," Lucinda interrupted. "If only he were here." "Well, he's not," Mrs. Holloway said practically. "And that lieutenant doesn't seem the patient type." Lucinda stood suddenly. "I need to send a message to the Diamondback Ranch. Immediately." "At this hour?" "It's nearly 9 o'clock. It can't wait until morning." "Do you know if anyone is heading north tonight?" Mrs. Holloway thought for a moment. "Old Ben sometimes makes late deliveries to the outlying ranches. He might be at the livery still, preparing for tomorrow." Lucinda hurried to her room, scribbled a note explaining the situation, and rushed to the livery stable. She found Ben loading supplies into a wagon and pressed a silver dollar into his hand along with the message. "Please," she begged. "It's urgent this reaches the Diamondback Ranch as soon as possible." Ben pocketed the coin with a nod. "Heading that direction anyway. Should reach there by dawn if the weather holds." Returning to the boarding house, Lucinda found Nahimana still awake, her dark eyes wide with worry. "Bad men come?" she asked in halting English. Lucinda gathered the child into her arms. "No one is going to take you anywhere," she promised. "We just need to be brave for a little while longer." That night, Lucinda barely slept, her mind racing through possibilities. Could she hide Nahimana somewhere? Run away with her? Both seemed impossible in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. By morning, she had formed a desperate plan. She dressed Nahimana in her warmest clothes, packed a small bag with essentials, and slipped downstairs before sunrise. Mrs. Holloway was already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. "I need to borrow a horse," Lucinda told her. And I need you to tell anyone who asks that Nahimana and I left yesterday to visit friends in Tucson. The older woman's eyes widened. You're running? Miss Blackwood, that's the only option I have, Lucinda finished. I won't let them take her to the reservation when Preston might be close to finding her real family. Mrs. Holloway sighed. The livery stable won't be open yet. I know. That's why I need your help. Your late husband's horse, Buttercup, hasn't been ridden in months. But she's gentle, you said so yourself. Please, Mrs. Holloway. I've never asked for anything before. After a moment's hesitation, the landlady nodded. Take the path behind the orchard. It leads to the old mining road, less chance of being seen. 20 minutes later, Lucinda was guiding Buttercup along the narrow trail, Nahimana seated before her on the saddle. The girl was quiet, sensing the gravity of their situation. Lucinda had only a vague idea of where the Diamondback Ranch lay, but she knew it was north of town. She followed the rising sun, keeping it to her right as she'd been taught growing up in Missouri. The desert landscape was beautiful in the early morning light, rose and gold and deep purple shadows. Under different circumstances, Lucinda might have appreciated its stark splendor. Now, she was focused solely on putting distance between them and Lieutenant Brooks. They rode steadily for nearly 2 hours before Nahimana began to fidget. Hungry, she announced, patting her stomach. Lucinda reined Buttercup to a halt in the shade of a large rock formation. She helped Nahimana down and unpacked some bread and dried fruit she'd brought, along with a canteen of water. As they ate, Lucinda studied their surroundings. The terrain was becoming more rugged, with rocky outcroppings and deeper arroyos. She wasn't sure if they were still heading in the right direction, and worry began to gnaw at her confidence. What if we can't find the ranch? She murmured. What if Preston already left to look for your family? Nahimana looked up at her, then pointed to the west. Home, she said clearly. Your home? Lucinda asked, surprised. You recognize this place? The girl nodded vigorously, then pointed again, and made a flowing motion with her hand. Water. Big rocks. Lucinda's heart leapt. Could they be near the place Nahimana had described, the river with big rocks? If so, her family's territory might be nearby. Show me, she said, packing up their small meal. Nahimana led confidently, walking ahead of Buttercup and occasionally stopping to examine something, a plant, a rock formation, once a set of tracks that made her point excitedly. They had been following the child's lead for perhaps an hour when Lucinda heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Her first instinct was to hide, fearing Lieutenant Brooks had discovered their deception and followed. She quickly dismounted and led Buttercup behind a large boulder, lifting Nahimana into her arms. The riders came into view, 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace along the trail below them. Lucinda's breath caught as she recognized the lead rider's copper-colored horse and broad-shouldered silhouette. Preston! She called, stepping out from behind the rock. The riders wheeled toward them, and Preston's face registered shock, then relief as he spurred his horse up the slope. Lucinda? What in heaven's name are you doing out here? He dismounted quickly, striding toward them. Are you all right? Is Nahimana? We're fine, Lucinda assured him, even as Nahimana launched herself at Preston, chattering excitedly. But there's trouble. An army lieutenant came to town yesterday. He wants to take Nahimana to the reservation. We left before dawn to find you. Preston's expression darkened. Brooks. I heard he was in the area. He turned to one of his companions, a weathered man with graying hair. Miguel, this is the child I told you about. The older man studied Nahimana carefully, then spoke to her in Apache. Her face lit up, and she responded rapidly, pointing repeatedly to the west. She recognizes him? Lucinda asked hopefully. Preston nodded. Miguel's wife is Apache. He thinks Nahimana might be from a band that sometimes camps near his brother-in-law's homestead. He turned back to the child. Did she lead you this way? Yes, she seemed to know where she was going. She mentioned water and big rocks. The river canyon, Preston said. It's about 5 miles west of here. If that's where she's from. He looked at his companions. We need to get her back to her people before Brooks finds her. The third man, younger than Miguel and dressed like a cowboy, spoke up. Boss, if the army's involved, we could be in serious trouble. Harboring unregistered Apache, I'm well aware of the risks, Jim. Preston interrupted. But I won't see a child separated from her family because of bureaucracy and prejudice. He turned back to Lucinda. You should return to town. I'll take Nahimana from here. No, Lucinda said firmly. I've come this far. I want to see this through. Preston studied her face, then nodded slowly. All right. But it could be dangerous. Brooks won't take kindly to being defied. I'm not afraid, she said, and realized it was true. For the first time in months, she felt something stronger than grief, a fierce determination to protect this child who had somehow worked her way into Lucinda's guarded heart. They rode west, following Miguel's lead, with Nahimana now perched before Preston on his saddle. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, and Lucinda was grateful for Buttercup's sure-footedness. As they rode, Preston explained what he'd discovered in his search. Miguel's brother-in-law lives near a band of Chiricahua who've managed to stay off the reservation by keeping to themselves in the canyon lands. They're peaceful, but proud, won't surrender their traditional ways. The design on Nahimana's medicine pouch matches their clan symbols. Do you think her family might still be there? Lucinda asked. The sheriff said there were signs they'd been taken by raiders. It's possible not all of them were captured, Preston said. Or they might have escaped. The Chiricahua are resourceful. They reached the canyon by midday. The big rocks Nahimana had described were massive red sandstone formations that flanked a small river, creating a natural fortress accessible only through narrow passes. Miguel led them to one such pass, then stopped and made a series of bird calls. After a tense moment, an answering call came from above. Nahimana bounced excitedly in front of Preston, calling out in her language. 3 Apache men appeared on the rocks above, rifles in hand. Miguel spoke to them at length, gesturing toward Nahimana. One of the men disappeared back into the canyon, and Miguel turned to Preston. They recognized the child, he said in heavily accented English. They send for her uncle. Lucinda's heart pounded with a mixture of hope and sudden sorrow. If Nahimana's family was here, she would be leaving with them. The realization that she might lose this child who had brought unexpected joy back into her life was painful, yet she knew it was right. They were led into the canyon, where a small encampment of perhaps 30 people was nestled against the far wall. Women paused in their work to stare, and children peeked curiously from behind their mothers' skirts. A tall man with streaks of gray in his long black hair stepped forward, studying Nahimana intently. The girl stared back, then suddenly gave a cry of recognition and launched herself toward him. He caught her, lifting her high as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Her uncle, Miguel explained. Yellow Wolf. He says her parents were taken by raiders 3 weeks ago, along with several others from their hunting party. The child was presumed lost or captured as well. Tears filled Lucinda's eyes as she watched the reunion. Yellow Wolf set Nahimana down, and the girl immediately began chattering, pointing repeatedly toward Lucinda and Preston. The Apache man approached them, dignity in every line of his body. He spoke, and Miguel translated. He says you have done what many white people would not. You protected a child not of your blood or race. The people do not forget such kindness. Preston responded through Miguel, explaining how Lucinda had cared for Nahimana and their flight from the army's representatives. Yellow Wolf listened gravely, then spoke again. He says the army has been searching these canyons. Soon they may find this place. His people prepare to move deeper into the mountains. Miguel hesitated, then continued. He asks if you would take a message to the army officer. Tell him the people wish only to live in peace on their ancestral lands, not on the reservation where many have sickened and died. Preston nodded. I'll try, but I can't promise he'll listen. Yellow Wolf spoke once more, his voice carrying authority despite its softness. He says you should go now, before the soldiers come. But first, his niece wishes to say goodbye. Nahimana approached Lucinda, her small face solemn. In halting English, she said, "Thank you. You good like mother." Lucinda knelt and embraced the child, unable to stop her tears. "I'll miss you," she whispered. "Be safe." Preston placed a hand on her shoulder. "We need to go," he said gently. "Give them time to move camp before Brooks arrives." The ride back was mostly silent. Lucinda struggled with conflicting emotions: joy that Nahimana had found her family, sorrow at losing her, worry about what Lieutenant Brooks might do if he tracked them to the canyon. "Do you think they'll be safe?" she asked as they neared the junction where the trails split toward town and the Diamondback Ranch. "Yellow Wolf is smart," Preston replied. "He'll lead his people somewhere the army won't easily follow. And Brooks may not be as determined as he seems. Hunting Apache through those canyons is dangerous work." They had just reached the junction when they heard riders approaching from the direction of town. Preston motioned them off the trail, behind a stand of mesquite. Lieutenant Brooks appeared, leading a squad of 6 soldiers. With them was Flying Eagle, scanning the ground for tracks. "They're following our trail," Preston muttered. "We need to divert them." He whispered instructions to Miguel and Jim, then turned to Lucinda. "I want you to ride to the ranch with Miguel. Jim and I will lead Brooks away from the canyon." "That's too dangerous," she protested. "What if they arrest you?" "I'm a respected rancher with friends in the territorial government," Preston said with a slight smile. "Brooks won't risk antagonizing me without good reason." His expression grew serious. "Please, Lucinda. Go with Miguel." Before she could argue further, he leaned forward and kissed her quickly but with unmistakable tenderness. "For luck," he whispered, then turned his horse toward the trail, Jim following close behind. Lucinda watched in stunned silence as Preston rode directly toward the soldiers, hailing them with a friendly wave. Even from a distance, she could see Lieutenant Brooks's surprise. "Come, Senora," Miguel urged. "The patron knows what he does." The Diamondback Ranch was larger than Lucinda had imagined, a sprawling adobe main house, bunkhouse, barns, and corrals spread across a valley surrounded by low hills. A stream ran behind the buildings, feeding a small orchard and garden. Miguel showed her to a comfortable guest room and introduced her to the housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, who brought fresh water and offered to prepare a bath. "The patron will return soon," she assured Lucinda. "He always does." Hours passed with no sign of Preston. Lucinda ate the dinner Mrs. Alvarez insisted upon, then paced the porch, watching the trail anxiously. Night fell, and still he didn't appear. Unable to sleep, she sat in a rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the desert chill. The stars blazed overhead, more numerous and brilliant than she'd ever seen in St. Louis. "Beautiful, aren't they?" She startled at Preston's voice, turning to find him standing at the bottom of the porch steps. Relief flooded through her. "You're all right," she breathed. "I was worried when you didn't return. Brooks took some convincing." Preston climbed the steps and settled into the chair beside her. "Jim and I led him on a merry chase through the hills nowhere near the canyon. Eventually, I persuaded him that pursuing a small band of peaceful Apache was less important than the cattle thieves operating along the border. And he believed you. He did when I offered to fund additional patrols to catch the rustlers." Preston smiled wryly. "Amazing how practical military men can be when funding is involved." Lucinda laughed softly and then froze, realizing what she'd done. It was the first time she'd laughed since William died. The realization brought tears to her eyes. Preston noticed her sudden emotion. "Lucinda? What's wrong?" "Nothing," she whispered. I laughed. "I haven't done that since." She couldn't finish. Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Since your baby died," he said gently. She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Tell me about him," Preston said softly. "Tell me about your son." The simple request broke something open inside her, not the raw wound of fresh grief, but a channel for memories that had been locked away. His name was William, she began hesitantly. William Thomas Blackwood. He had the most beautiful blue eyes, like cornflowers. And his hands, they were so tiny, but perfect, with little dimples where the knuckles should be. Once she started, the words poured out. She told Preston about William's birth, how he'd been smaller than expected but with a robust cry that made the midwife laugh. How he developed a dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. How he loved to be sung to, especially at night. He was just learning to roll over when he got sick, she said, her voice steadier now. The fever came so suddenly. One day he was fine, the next. She took a deep breath. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done. But I still wonder if I missed something, if I could have saved him somehow. Preston took her hand gently. You loved him. You did everything a mother could do. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, life takes unexpected turns. I know that in my mind, Lucinda admitted. But my heart has been so empty. Not empty, Preston corrected softly. Full of love that had nowhere to go. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the compassion in his eyes. Today, with Nahimana finding her family, it hurt to let her go, but it felt right, too. Like I was honoring William's memory by helping another child. You gave Nahimana safety and love when she needed it most, Preston said. And you risked a great deal to ensure she was reunited with her people. That takes courage and an open heart. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert coyotes in the distance, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods by the stream. What happens now? Lucinda asked finally. That's up to you, Preston replied. You could return to town tomorrow. School starts soon, doesn't it? Yes, in 3 days. She hesitated. And you? Will you go back to your search for Nahimana's parents? Preston shook his head. Yellow Wolf said they were taken by raiders who sell captives in Mexico. Finding them would be nearly impossible. But I've promised to send word to contacts I have across the border, just in case. Another silence fell between them, laden with unspoken thoughts. About that kiss, Preston said finally, his voice low. I should apologize. It was presumptuous of me. Lucinda studied their still joined hands. Was it only for luck? She asked quietly. No, he admitted. I've wanted to kiss you since that day by the waterfall. But I know it's too soon. You're still grieving, and I respect that. She considered his words, searching her own heart. Grief doesn't have a timetable, she said slowly. I'll always miss Thomas and William. But today I realize something: life continues. And perhaps there's room for new feelings alongside the old ones. Preston's eyes held hers, hope kindling in their blue depths. What are you saying, Lucinda? I'm saying I'd like to see where this path leads, she answered. Slowly, one step at a time. His smile was gentle. I'd like that too. And I'm a patient man. The next morning, Preston drove Lucinda back to town in his buggy. Mrs. Holloway greeted them with evident relief, having been questioned by Lieutenant Brooks after their disappearance. I told him you'd gone to visit friends in Tucson, she said. He seemed skeptical, but he left yesterday with his men. Something about cattle rustlers. Preston suppressed a smile. Well, the territory has its share of problems. School began, and Lucinda threw herself into teaching with renewed purpose. The emptiness inside her hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed less a gaping wound, more a tender scar that reminded her of what she'd lost without crippling her. Preston visited whenever his ranch duties allowed, usually once a week. Their courtship progressed slowly, with proper chaperoned outings and occasional dinners at the hotel. Mrs. Holloway watched with approving eyes, though she refrained from the matchmaking comments she'd made when Preston first arrived. In late October, a letter arrived from Tucson, addressed to both Preston and Lucinda. It was from Miguel's brother-in-law, relaying news from Yellow Wolf's band. Nahimana was thriving with her uncle's family, and word had come through traders that her parents might have escaped their captors and be making their way north from Mexico. "That's wonderful news," Lucinda said, her eyes bright with tears of happiness. "I pray they find each other again." Preston squeezed her hand. Families belong together. As fall deepened into winter, their relationship grew stronger. Preston was unfailingly patient, never rushing Lucinda or making demands, yet his feelings were clear in every gesture and look. On Christmas Eve, he invited her to the ranch for dinner, sending his buggy to collect her. The main house was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, a large tree standing in the corner of the parlor, adorned with candles and homemade ornaments. "It's beautiful," Lucinda said, admiring the festive scene. "Mrs. Alvarez insisted," Preston explained. "She says Christmas should be properly celebrated, even by a bachelor rancher." They enjoyed a delicious meal, then exchanged small gifts by the fire, a handsome leather-bound journal from Preston to Lucinda, and a hand-knitted scarf from her to him. "There's one more thing," Preston said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden object and placed it in her hand. "I carved this myself. Not very skillfully, I'm afraid." It was a little horse, carefully shaped from pale wood. Despite Preston's disclaimer, the details were lovingly rendered: the flowing mane, the alert ears, the sturdy legs. "It's lovely," Lucinda said, touched by the personal gift. "Thank you." "Turn it over," he suggested. On the underside, he had carved a name, William. Tears welled in Lucinda's eyes. "Preston. I thought. Perhaps it could be something to remember him by. Something small enough to carry with you." He looked uncertain. "If it's not appropriate, it's perfect," she interrupted, closing her hand around the little horse. "No one has ever." She swallowed hard. "Most people avoid mentioning him, as if saying his name might break me." "William deserves to be remembered," Preston said simply. "He was your son. He'll always be part of who you are." In that moment, looking at this man who understood her grief without being afraid of it, Lucinda knew with certainty that her heart had healed enough to love again. "Preston," she said softly, "would you kiss me again? Not for luck this time." He moved closer, cupping her face gently in his calloused hands. "Are you certain?" She nodded, and he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. "I never thought I could, after Thomas. But you've shown me that the heart has room for more than one love. I've loved you since that day by the waterfall," Preston admitted. "But I was willing to wait as long as necessary." "No more waiting," Lucinda said. "Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste." Spring brought new beginnings. Wildflowers carpeted the desert, cacti bloomed in brilliant colors, and Lucinda found herself smiling more often than not. Her students noticed the change, responding with greater enthusiasm to her lessons. In April, exactly 1 year after William's death, Preston accompanied Lucinda to the church. She carried a small bouquet of desert flowers and the wooden horse he had carved. "I'd like to say a prayer for him," she explained. "To mark the day, but not in darkness." They sat together in a pew, hands linked, as Lucinda spoke softly of her son, his smile, his laugh, the way he had brought joy to her life for his brief time on earth. There were tears, but they were healing tears, not the bitter salt of despair. Afterward, they walked to the hidden valley with the waterfall, now lush with spring growth. Preston spread a blanket under the cottonwoods, and they shared a picnic lunch. "I have something to ask you," he said as they sat watching the play of light on the water. "Something I've been wanting to ask for months." Lucinda's heart quickened. "Yes? Lucinda Blackwood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "I can't promise a life without challenges, but I can promise to face them by your side, to cherish your past while building our future, and to love you with everything I am for as long as I live." Joy pure and uncomplicated welled up within her. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married in June, in the church where they had prayed for William. The schoolchildren sang, Mrs. Holloway wept openly, and the sheriff gave Lucinda away in place of her distant family. As they exchanged vows, Lucinda wore her mother's pearls and carried a bouquet of desert blooms like the ones Preston had given her that first evening. In her pocket, she carried the wooden horse, a reminder that love never truly dies, it just finds new ways to express itself. The surprise came at the reception, held at the hotel. As they greeted their guests, a commotion at the door drew their attention. Miguel entered, accompanied by Yellow Wolf and Nahimana, holding the hands of a man and woman who could only be her parents. They found each other. Preston breathed, squeezing Lucinda's hand. Nahimana broke away from her parents and ran to Lucinda, throwing her arms around her waist. "Teacher!" she cried in English. "I come for wedding!" Lucinda knelt, embracing the child who had helped heal her heart. "I'm so happy to see you," she said. "And even happier to meet your parents." Through Miguel's translation, they learned that Nahimana's parents had indeed escaped their captors and made the long journey back to Arizona. Yellow Wolf had received Preston's invitation to the wedding and decided it was a safe opportunity to bring his niece to see the woman who had protected her. "Your kindness is not forgotten," Nahimana's father said through Miguel. "My daughter speaks often of the woman with sad eyes who became happy again." The wedding celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing that brought together the diverse community of Copper Creek. As Preston led Lucinda in a dance, she looked around at the faces townspeople, ranch hands, and the small Apache family who had slipped away before the night ended and felt a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. "Happy?" Preston asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later that night, in the privacy of the ranch house that was now their home, Lucinda opened the locket she still wore. Inside were the tiny portraits of Thomas and William. "I'll always keep them here," she told Preston, touching the locket. "But I've made room in my heart for you, for us, for whatever the future brings." "Including, perhaps, more children someday?" he asked cautiously. The question didn't bring pain as it once would have. Instead, Lucinda felt a flutter of anticipation. "Yes," she said. "I think William would like having brothers or sisters, even if he watches over them from heaven." Preston kissed her with all the love and promise of their new beginning. "Then we'll build our family together, one day at a time, remembering the past while embracing the future." A year later, almost to the day, Lucinda gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They named the boy Preston after his father, and the girl they called Hope, for what she represented in their lives. As Lucinda sat in the rocking chair on the porch, nursing Hope while Preston Jr. slept in his cradle beside her, she watched her husband approaching from the corral. His face lit up at the sight of them, as it did every time. "My family," he said simply, bending to kiss her and touch his sleeping son's cheek. "Our family," Lucinda corrected with a smile. She glanced at the small shelf inside the nearby window, where William's wooden horse stood alongside a photograph of their wedding day and a newer edition, a family portrait including the twins. The past and present, side by side, each with its rightful place in her heart. Life had taken unexpected turns, bringing sorrow she'd thought would destroy her. Yet here she was, surrounded by love, her heart scarred but stronger for the healing. As Preston settled beside her, taking his son from the cradle to hold against his chest, Lucinda remembered that day nearly 2 years ago, when a stranger had said the words that changed everything. "Tell me about him." In opening that door to her grief, he had ultimately opened the way to her healing. Lucinda leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, their daughter nursing contentedly at her breast, and knew with perfect certainty that this moment, this life, this love was exactly where she was meant to be.